well, welcome to the Name, Image, Likeness, and Sport Agency Symposium. We are glad you are here. Thank you for being proactive in your careers. And the reason this is actually created is because of you. I've gotten to know some of you and heard a lot of interest in the sport agency world. And then name, image, likeness for anybody who's getting involved in college sports, pro sports, and now even high school sports, to be in the nose of the trends that are coming. So first, we're going to have Kristi Dosh. She is going to be sharing on name, image, likeness. But before she comes up here and I give her solid intro, which is long and awesome, we're going to go over basically the way the schedule is going to run. So this is the 1 o'clock session on name, image, likeness. She's going to give her presentation, and there's not going to be questions until later on. And then we're going to transition, and Curran's going to come up and speak on working in marketing with NBA players in a sport agency. And then we're going to have another solid break where you guys will have about 15 to you'll have a small break and then the next transition, and then I'll do a Q&A with them based on questions we've seen come through the feed and or questions I feel like haven't been answered. And then after that, we'll have a 20-minute break, and you will go on. You will divide so you guys get actually a lot closer time with them to ask questions and kind of hear about career engagement topics like resume building, how to break into the industry, and things like that. So thank you to all of our Zoomers who are coming on. We've had many people. We've had a lot of interest. We actually couldn't go public with the link because there was so much. We were afraid people wouldn't have their questions answered. So yes, we are being recorded right now. So along with you guys is 59 people signed up. I'm not really sure where they're at right now, but yeah, so we're excited, but no, this is being recorded. So just keep noises down to a minimum if possible. So with all that being said, I will go ahead and introduce Kristi Dosh. Kristi received her bachelor's in politics from Oglethorpe University, and then she got her law degree at University of Florida. So she is a Gator grad. And then she went on to work as a legal secretary for White and Johnson and an associate for Mullins before transitioning into sports business reporting. So she actually has a law degree, but has done a lot of business reporting. Her work in sports business reporting includes Forbes, Comcast Sports Southeast, and ESPN. She's been an adjunct professor at UNF. She's also been a radio host for 1010XL and a director of sport marketing for Reputation Link. She has written a book called Saturday Millionaires, How Winning Football Builds Winning Colleges, and has been a contributing writer for Fast Company and Entrepreneur Media. She's currently the founder and publicist for Guide My Brand, and a writer, a reporter, and a public speaker for Sport Business Enterprises. Is that how I say it? I'm always practicing that one. So she's going to come up and share. We're so excited. So if you guys could give her a round of applause.
The moral of my story is that I write too much, and all those jobs, that's what they have in common is writing, because I love to write. So I have been writing about the business of college sports for close to 12 years now, both for Forbes and for my own site, businessofcollegesports.com. And name, image, and likeness is really interesting to me because when I think back to how we got here, I think that it started about the same time I started writing about the business of college sports. Not because of me, but our timelines really align because that's when a lot of the discussion around how student athletes can and should be compensated really started to heat up. And I'm going to talk really briefly about that and sort of go into where we are now and how it has been playing out so far. So just to kind of get us started with what the rules were around name, image, and likeness prior to this summer is that the NCAA did not allow student athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness. That meant they couldn't be compensated for their autograph. They couldn't be compensated for social media posts. When they appeared in video games, which we're going to talk about in a second, they couldn't be compensated for use of their name, image, and likeness in that video game. And part of what the NCAA was trying to protect against was undue influence from boosters and others who might try to funnel money to student athletes through these opportunities to get them to go to a specific school or stay at a specific school or maybe transfer to a specific school. So we can talk a little bit about how that has started playing out. But for me, all of this started with the Ed O'Bannon case. It was an early case that I covered when I first started writing about the business of college sports. I will not bore you with tons of legal details, but I want to go through just a couple of cases to show you how these dominoes started to fall, because I think what we saw happen this summer with name, image, and likeness legislation changing and student athletes now being allowed to profit off their name, image, and likeness started with the Ed O'Bannon case. Not to say that the conversation had never been had before that, but I think that that's when we started to see real change. And it has now taken us a decade to get where we are now, where we are allowing student athletes to profit off their name, image, and likeness. So at issue in the O'Bannon case was the EA Sports NCAA basketball game. There was a football game and a basketball game. Ed O'Bannon was a UCLA basketball player who believed that his image and likeness were being used in the EA Sports game and that student athletes should be compensated for that use. EA Sports, even if they had wanted to, couldn't have compensated student athletes because of NCAA rules. What Ed O'Bannon was looking for in that case wasn't money. He wanted the judge to issue an injunction saying that EA Sports could no longer produce the game if they weren't going to compensate the people whose name, image, and likeness they were using in the game. And he won that case. I'll tell you what ended up coming out of that case. EA Sports actually prior to that stopped producing the football and basketball games during the course of this case. I think it was filed in 2009, but the decision didn't happen until 2013 or 2014. So there was this long period of time between when everybody was sort of put on notice about this and when there was an actual ruling. So EA Sports voluntarily pulled those off the market. They have never come back. However, EA Sports has already announced they are bringing back the college football game, and I would imagine they will also bring back the basketball game, although they have not officially confirmed that yet. Ed O'Bannon wasn't trying to kill the video game. I've seen him talk in interviews about how people attack him on Twitter all the time about how he ruined the video games and it's his fault they went away. What ended up actually coming out of that case is that the judge in that case said that universities and athletic departments could not set a cap on the way they compensated student athletes to tuition, room, and board, that they needed to pay up to cost of attendance at the very least. I won't get into it. There were some weird things in her ruling. She talked about this $5,000 stipend and a trust, and there were all sorts of ideas going on at that time. But the practical outcome of that case is that schools were allowed to go to cost of attendance. And so instead of just paying tuition, room, and board, they could pay up to cost of attendance. And if you look back during that time, you'll see a lot of conversation around cost of attendance stipends. And there was a fear that because some schools, the cost of attendance stipend would be higher than other schools because the cost of living in some cities is higher than others. So maybe a student athlete at UCLA would get more than a student athlete at Florida because LA is a more expensive place to live than Gainesville is. In most cases, I've lived in both, and it was definitely more expensive to live in Southern California than it was here in Gainesville. And so there was a lot of conversation around whether that was going to impact recruiting and students would want to go to schools with larger cost of attendance stipends. Almost 10 years later, we haven't seen that be the case. I've never seen anyone allege that that is the case and that that's what came out of that. But that's really what we got from that case was cost of attendance stipends. And then shortly thereafter, we had the Keller case, which was also about the EA Sports video games. But in that case, they were seeking monetary damages. They wanted the players who've been depicted in the games to be compensated for use of their image and likeness in the game. And they ended up settling with the NCAA, EA Sports, and CLC, which is Collegiate Licensing Company. They hold the licenses for a lot of the universities that were depicted in the game. That settlement was a total of $16 million, and it was distributed to student athletes who believed that they had appeared in games. And it was based on the number of times you had appeared and a number of other factors, but the payouts ended up being from a few $100s to, I think the highest paid player I remember seeing was around $5,000. Don't quote me on that. It's been a little while since I looked that up. But what we got out of that case was some former student athletes getting paid out for their appearance in those games. And he's not going to let me pull up more bullets. I think the clicker has died.
Is it really?
I think so. Thank you. We can at least get through a few more bullets. The other thing we saw, you'd stop there. I'm going to at least go through these. So the other thing that we have seen come out of the cases that happened during that time period is also unlimited meals and snacks.
There used to be very strict rules around how you could feed student athletes, and it didn't always make a lot of sense because student athletes, obviously, they're in classes, they're in practice, they're at games, they're in study halls. They had all these things that didn't fit the schedule in a lot of cases, and some teams would get to eat, and other teams wouldn't get to eat, and it was sort of a mess. And you had student athletes who were getting violations for really silly things around being provided really basic, snacks to get them from one practice to the next. And so now universities and athletic departments are allowed to offer unlimited meals and snacks to student athletes. Also out of those cases, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you're welcome to ask questions about it later. Northwestern's football team attempted to unionize. They wanted to be declared employees and have the right to collectively bargain with the university and the athletic department for their compensation, for their practice times, for everything, the way that we see in pro athletics with collective bargaining. On the regional level, the student athletes actually won, and they ruled in favor of the student athletes. But when it went to the National Labor Relations Board, they sort of punted. They really didn't give a decision so much as they decided on procedural grounds to kick it out. Unionization is an interesting topic because at public universities, you might see different things than at private universities. In about half of the states, public employees cannot unionize. So if you were at a public university like this and you were deemed to be an employee as a student athlete, then if state law didn't allow public employees to unionize, you wouldn't be able to, even though maybe student athletes at University of Wisconsin could. And I'm not up to date on my state by state union law, so I'm not going to pretend that those examples are accurate. But you would see it being treated differently across the country, and there would also be very different rules between private universities and public. So we'll talk on a later slide about where I think we're headed as far as potential unionization and classification as employees go, but we've not gotten there at this point. None of the cases have declared student athletes to be employees, and so they are not paid like employees. The last case that happened was this summer. The last sort of important case to this discussion, in my opinion, was the Alston case. The Supreme Court decision came down this summer, 9-0, which is incredibly rare in Supreme Court decisions that everybody gets along and agrees, but on this they did. It did not speak directly to NIL. It was actually about what they consider education-related expenses. And so athletic departments are now allowed to offer money for study abroad, for postgraduate internships, for additional tutoring, for laptops, anything they can tie back to education. They now have the ability to offer to student athletes, and there's no limit on that. For our discussion here, the important thing about the Alston case is that it happened 2 weeks before state laws on name, image, and likeness were set to go into effect. And I think it did have a major impact on the way the NCAA decided to handle NIL, because back in January, they had released proposed rules that had guardrails. There were all these rules around how student athletes could do deals, who they could do them with, certain banned categories, the ways in which boosters could work with student athletes. It was a much longer document. And when we finally got the rule this summer in the 11th hour, literally the day before the state laws were set to go into effect on July 1st, there were essentially 3 parts of the rule. And they said that if you live in a state that has an active state law, you follow the state law. If you live in a state that does not have an active state law, then you follow your institutional policy. And then the third prong of it talked about how you can now hire agents, attorneys, financial advisors relative to just NIL marketing. And Brandon, we'll talk about it later, but this is still not a situation where you're hiring an agent to help you with your pro opportunities while you're still in school, but they can help you with your NIL marketing activities. So that was really it. That was all we got from the NCAA were those 3 prongs. They had a frequently asked questions document that gives you a little more insight into things, but they really backed off of the guardrails they were going to have. And it's had an interesting impact because a lot of schools, most schools, were counting on the NCAA to set the rules. And all of a sudden in the 11th hour, they found out they have to set their own rules. There are still schools right now, 2 months later, who don't have rules. I was just at University of Louisville a couple of weeks ago, and while I was there, they did not have active rules. They had a letter that had been sent out to boosters that talked about what they thought they were and were not going to allow, but there were actually no rules under which their student athletes were acting. Since I was there 2 weeks ago, they have now released their rules. It is the longest rule document I've seen so far. It is 14 pages. So there's this real variance from one school to the next. Some schools have simple one-page guidelines. Louisville has 14, and then there's everything in between as well. And so now we have this, I keep calling it a patchwork of rules and laws, because some states have NIL laws that say that student athletes can profit off their name, image, and likeness. Some have passed laws, but they're not in effect yet. And then institutions have rules. Eventually, I imagine they will all have them, but some of them are still scrambling and working with their legal departments to put these rules together. And so it's been interesting in the early days as brands and student athletes have tried to navigate this when they don't exactly know what the rules are.
It's working again. Thank you.
So there are close to 20 states now that have laws that are either active or go active before the end of the year. I was just sitting here at my computer updating the list. So if that's something you're interested in, you want to check out, if you go on business@collegesports.com, there's a menu item that says trackers. And under trackers, there's a state law tracker where you can see all the links to the state laws, what date they're effective, which states are still pending and working on laws. There's also a tracker of institutional policies. If for some reason you want to look at Florida's or any other school that I've been able to hunt down and see what the rules are, you can. They vary greatly at some institutions. For example, at some institutions, if you're over 21, you can do a brand deal with an alcohol brand. But at some schools, you can't, no matter what age you are. Almost all of them have bans on tobacco, on gambling companies. But then it varies by school beyond that. Some talk about CBD products and some don't. Some talk about prescription drugs and some don't. I finally saw, I don't know, maybe 20 schools had rules out in the first like 24 hours of this kind of happening on July 1st. And one school was the first I saw to put in there that you couldn't promote adult entertainment sites or venues. And then all of a sudden, all these other schools were like, oh, we forgot about that category and we're adding it in. And so a lot of these are evolving. Sometimes I go back to that institutional policy tracker that I have and I click on a link and it's broken because they've taken it back down because either they're revising their rules or they've moved it somewhere else and they are still tweaking it. And so student athletes and brands are out there creating deals with ever-changing rules, literally sometimes changing on a daily basis. I'm going to sort of skip over NIA, except to say that they passed their legislation before the NCAA did. They passed theirs last October. And I asked the president of NAIA, I had him on my podcast, and I said, why do you think you were able to get this done faster than the NCAA was able to? And he had on his bookshelf behind him the NAIA rule book, which is like this thick, and then the NCAA, which is like multiple volumes. A greater number of student athletes at the NCAA level, but also there's always been a greater level of violations when it comes to improper payments to student athletes and booster involvement. And so the NAIA was able to get that passed a little more quickly. My clicker stopped working. It only likes me sometimes. And I would just say about federal laws, multiple federal laws were proposed last year. None of them were passed before the state laws went into effect. You know, a lot of folks have lobbied for those federal laws because they want there to be one national standard. It would certainly make life easier. I was joking with Brandon, my reporting would be so much less interesting right now if there was one national law. Part of what's been interesting as a reporter has been following all these differences. There had been a lot of momentum for a federal law leading up to July 1st. But I've talked to a lot of folks since then that were involved in that process, and the momentum has sort of died. Part of that is because they're not in session, but part of it is because now we're seeing it play out. We're a couple of months in and there haven't been any real egregious violations. We haven't seen anyone at least getting caught doing anything, you know, that violates any of the rules. And so the momentum for that federal law, I think, has really slowed down at this point, and I'm not convinced there's going to be one. If there is one, it wouldn't be until next year. But at this point, I'm not positive that there's going to be one. So. A few, you can go ahead and do, I think there's 3 bullets on the slide. Thank you. A few issues that have popped up are with international student athletes. Due to their student visa rules, they are not allowed to participate in NIL. There are very strict rules about the amount of time they can work, and they're only allowed to work within the university. And so they haven't been able to monetize their name, image, and likeness. We had somebody in here earlier today that was saying that Florida is going to maybe shift part of their policy about making money when you're outside of the country. And so a lot of schools are trying to figure out how can they help their international student athletes take advantage of this, because as it stands right now, every athletic department I know of has told their international student athletes that they cannot do these deals right now because they risk their student visa. And that's obviously not something the school can control. So we need guidance from the federal government on how it's supposed to play out for international student athletes. And then high school athletes have been a really interesting aspect of this as well, because when the NCAA put out their frequently asked questions, they specifically said high school student athletes, have at it. You can do NIL deals too. And then the woman who's the president of the National High School Association, and I'm going to screw up the name of the association, but she came out and said, wait a second, no, our state high school association rules say that you cannot monetize your name, image, and likeness, and we don't want to change that. And so it's been interesting to watch that play out, because in the state of California, it is allowed by law that high school and younger youth student athletes can monetize their name, image, and likeness. In Texas, Mississippi, and Illinois, in their state laws that were passed to allow college student athletes to monetize their NIL, it specifically says that high school student athletes cannot monetize their NIL. And so we saw something really interesting happen in Texas. Quinn Ewers, who's the #1 commit for next football season, decided to forego his final year of high school. He only had one required class left, and he decided to forego his senior year, hurry up and finish, and start at Ohio State this fall, because he was being offered reportedly 7 figures of over $1 million in NIL deals. He has already signed, I think, 2 NIL deals. I'm not sure that I believe that those are worth 7 figures. And Brandon will maybe talk about this later. He said something interesting when we were talking about it earlier today in terms of how deals are structured so that you can say things like it's a 6-figure deal, it's a 7-figure deal. But he did choose to leave high school early and enroll at Ohio State so that he could take advantage of NIL deals, because Texas state law doesn't allow him to. We saw Mikey Williams, one of the top basketball recruits, go to an elite academy to complete his basketball career because they're not subject to the state high school association rules. So I've been kind of interested to see how many elite student athletes will we see moving to private institutions or to these elite academies where they're not under the state high school association rules and can monetize their name, image, and likeness. So I think we're still learning how that's going to play out. And some state high school associations are considering removing the restriction. I think it's New York is going to vote on it in October. So I do think it's possible that we'll see some states decide to start lifting those laws, but that is still, or not laws, but rules. But that's still sort of an evolving area of this. And then you've got Title IX considerations. And as somebody with a law degree, I always found Title IX really interesting. And it's not so much that women aren't going to have opportunities. It's about the equal treatment from the athletic department. So for example, Notre Dame put up a bunch of billboards for their football recruits. This was actually prior to July 1st. It was earlier in the summer. And on those billboards, they had the student athlete's photo and their name, and they had their social media handles on there. And it was, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 incoming student athletes. And I asked the question to some Title IX experts I know, is that kosher? Can the athletic department be marketing these individual male student athletes and plugging their social media channels and not doing the same for some female student athletes? Because now that there's money on the line with NIL, even though that money doesn't come from the athletic department, you're giving more marketing and promotion to these male student athletes. UCF did it during their spring football game. Notre Dame's not the only one. There've been a number of instances of this. And so that's something I'm kind of keeping my eye on. And then I also had a compliance officer bring up a really interesting point with me. If you've been following NIL at all, you might have heard of companies, Open Doors and Influencer. They provided services even prior to NIL to athletic departments, where athletic departments can upload photos and videos that their official photographers have taken at games for student athletes to use on their social media or their websites. They can't earn money from those photos because they utilize school intellectual property, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they can use it if they just need content on their timeline. And they've been doing that even before NIL. Well, now the question is coming up, what if you have every football student athlete has 300 photos of himself in there, but the female volleyball players have 6 each. Is that a Title IX violation? And I had quite frankly never thought of that before until a compliance person brought it up. But several schools told me that they're now being very careful about the assets they're offering to their student athletes and making sure that that's equal across both their male and their female student athletes. Okay, so what we've kind of seen happen that's been neat is this new economy forming around NIL. So we've seen new compliance platforms come out. There was software previously that athletic departments used for compliance, but we've seen a lot more that are very focused on NIL and on student athletes reporting these deals as they get them. Some of those compliance platforms, most of them, also offer education. So they've got short videos and document resources within those platforms so that if a student athlete wants to do one-on-one coaching or they want to hold a clinic, there's information in there about, you know, legal and insurance needs to be able to carry out those things. So we've seen a lot of those platforms either expand from what they were already doing with athletic departments or new software and platforms come into the space. And then we've seen a lot of content platforms and marketplaces come into the space. And I literally get pitched a new one, I think, every single day as a reporter. A new platform that has popped up that's going to match student athletes with brands, or that's going to allow student athletes to sell their own t-shirts, or it's going to allow them to sell game worn gear and memorabilia or their autographs. And so you're seeing a lot of people come into this space from the outside to try to help student athletes monetize their name, image, and likeness. And these companies want to get their foothold in this space as well, because there's a little bit of a big money grab going on in this space right now. A lot of really great companies with innovative technology and ideas. And quite frankly, I've been pitched a lot of companies that have no idea what they're doing in this space. So I've got a tracker on my site as well that tracks all the marketplaces. And I've really only put marketplaces on there that I've had a chance to look at and somewhat vet, although I have a disclaimer still on that page. But I've been pitched a lot of companies I haven't put there because I don't think that they are doing things correctly and they don't have student athletes' best interests at heart. And I don't want to see student athletes losing their eligibility over these things. So there are a number of marketplaces out there. And if you're a student athlete or you know somebody who is, I would just encourage them to try and talk to other people who've used the platform and get a feel for how it worked out for them, to really understand how that platform works, how the revenue share works, how much of your money are they going to take? Are they taking it from you? Are they taking it from the brand that's working with you? And I think maybe on the next slide, I've got a little, I have to talk about those things. Okay, so this is part of the tracker that's on my website. It's much longer than this, but I put just a snippet of it so that you can see. So it's got the platform and then tells you what that particular platform does. And then I also went in and have tried to figure out, and I've gotten most of them, and figured out what the fees or the revenue share are. So for some, they're totally passing the fees to the brand or to the customer who's purchasing something from you. And in some cases, they're taking as much as 30% from you. So I've told student athletes to really pay attention to that, because there's a lot of platforms you could be on, and why be on one that's going to take 30% of your money if you don't have to be? Now, that's not to say that there's never a reason to be on platforms that do, but just to be aware that there are those big differences between marketplaces. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to run kind of quickly through how we've seen student athletes making money so far. So social media marketing was definitely the first thing that we saw, because that was the low-hanging fruit. A lot of student athletes already had huge platforms and huge followings on social media. So there were a lot of brands that were lining up deals even prior to July 1st with student athletes. That student athletes were then signing on July 1st so that it met with rules where they would be promoting the brand on their social media. And I've seen a lot of student athletes taking advantage of that who don't have huge followings. There's a softball student athlete that I've worked with, and I think she has 1,300 followers on Instagram, but she's actually worked with 3 different brands already. They're local brands who are very supportive of her school, and in particular of her softball program, who already knew her and wanted to reach more of her audience. And so she has been able to monetize, even though she doesn't necessarily have the largest following. And then we've seen people on the other end of the spectrum. Like I reported a deal last week on Libby Dunn, who's a gymnast at LSU. She is the most followed college athlete in America. She has a huge following on TikTok and on Instagram, and she just did a mid-six figures deal with an athletic wear brand last week. She's going to be doing social media promo and I think personal appearances for them for the next 2 years. And so it'll be interesting to see a longer term, bigger deal like that play out. We've also seen student athletes putting together their own camps and clinics. A lot of those were already happening over the summer as soon as this went into effect. A lot of student athletes doing one-on-one coaching, sometimes in person. Some of those platforms that I talked about also offer virtual lessons where student athletes have been able to monetize virtually in giving lessons to younger athletes. We've seen them making personal appearances already at restaurants and car dealerships and that sort of thing. They're selling their autographs and memorabilia. They are starting to get involved in group licensing deals. So UF signed a deal already with Brandar, which is a company that is going in and signing with athletic departments to get the licensing rights to the athletic department's logos and intellectual property. And then they can turn around and do group deals with student athletes. So if the whole baseball team wants to do something together, Brandar can help them pull that together and has the right to the university's intellectual property. In order to do that, mostly what I've seen talked about in that space is trading cards. And I think that's some of the first group licensing sort of opportunities that you'll see come out of groups like Brandar, but there are opportunities for greater group licensing as well. We've seen student athletes creating their own merchandise. Sometimes they're creating it totally on their own, selling it on their own platform. Sometimes they're partnering with existing platforms and existing clothing wear brands to create things in partnership with them. We've seen a lot of affiliate or ambassador roles where they're going to get paid based on people clicking on their link or using their promo code. I just reported on one of those yesterday. A jeans company did a deal. They offered it to the entire Ole Miss football team. And these jeans are custom fit. They are $450 jeans. I don't know about you guys, but I don't own $450 jeans. And they get a free pair of jeans in exchange for social media promotion, but then they also get a unique code. And anytime their code is used to order jeans, they get $100 per pair of jeans sold, and there's no ceiling on it. So if you had somebody who had a real passion for fashion and had a great following, they could maybe make some decent money off of that. In fact, I tweeted about it yesterday because I wrote the story. And one of the quotes in the story from the brand was about how even I think it was the third string kicker, got the opportunity for this deal. And I had 2 different people tweet at me today that asked, who is the third string kicker and what is his promo code? Because I want to order the jeans and use his code because I think it'd be really cool to make sure he gets paid. So it'd be interesting to see. I mean, they say that on Twitter. Are they actually ordering $450 jeans? I don't know. But it was sort of interesting to see fans' reaction to that. And it was overall really positive, at least in my Twitter feed. And Twitter is so rarely positive that that it was nice to see. So we've seen a lot of those affiliate and ambassador kind of situations. And then we're starting to see more and more with NFTs. In fact, I have a story I think coming in the next week or two, actually with a former college basketball player who's going to do a really cool NFT. But we've seen a few of those so far. We've seen student athletes who already have existing blogs or podcasts who are monetizing those. There have also been a lot of student athletes, especially in football because we're in season, who are getting paid to go on radio shows or podcasts as a guest. I did a story a couple of weeks ago that was about a podcast called The J Boy Show. It's a mainly SEC football podcast. And they were paying, I think it's 7 different SEC football players to come on weekly and discuss the game from the week before and the upcoming game. And I'm trying to remember now off the top of my head, I think they're getting $250 per episode to do that. And I think that's interesting because radio stations have long paid pro players to come do this. In fact, my husband worked in sports talk radio, and I knew they had done a deal with Tim Tebow years ago. And I was like, do you remember how much you guys were paying him per week? Like, I was just curious how it was different from what we're seeing student athletes get. Unfortunately, he couldn't remember how much it was, but he thought from a radio perspective, $250 a week was fair and was a good deal for a radio station or for a podcast to get those guys on to talk about the game, because historically, athletic departments have not really wanted their student athletes to go on the radio and talk about the game. And you had to go through the SID and you had to get permission to talk to them. And most of the time you were told no. And now student athletes really sort of have that agency to make that decision for themselves. And we're seeing them go on radio shows and podcasts and give this sort of inside look at their game that we weren't getting before. So I found those kind of media deals to be interesting. And then I've had a lot of student athletes ask me about getting paid for public speaking. And I think that's really cool because when I was your age, I don't think I ever would have imagined I would have been interested in getting up in a room full of people and talking. And now it's part of my career and I love it. And I do it all the time in front of enormous audiences. And I think it's so much fun. But at your age, I'm pretty sure I would have been terrified and had no interest. But a lot of student athletes have shown interest in that. And then we've seen student athletes who are monetizing their music, their art, they are becoming entrepreneurs. A lot of the marketplaces that we've seen are founded by either former student athletes or current student athletes. Dreamfield is one of the ones I've seen that really is doing a decent number of deals for student athletes. And the co-founders for that are the quarterback from FSU and the quarterback from Miami, which I also think is cool because who would think those guys would even be friends? And now they have created this company together where they're helping other student athletes get more NIL deals. And that's been a surprising part of NIL that I personally enjoyed, is seeing how student athletes are helping each other. There've been a lot of quarterbacks and people who already have great exposure and great followings who, when they get offered a deal, instead of just taking it for themselves, are saying, how could we restructure this deal so I could include my whole offensive line? Or what could we do that's a whole team deal? And so we've seen a lot of group deals happening, especially during football season for football teams. And I've seen a few already for both men's and women's basketball teams. And there are these group deals or full team deals. And I think that's really cool. It's not something I expected to happen with NIL, but has been really neat to see play out. And then as far as potential issues popping up, there's a lot when it comes to the social media marketing space in terms of figuring out what the contract should look like. How much should you be getting paid? If you're getting paid for an Instagram post, how long should that post stay up? It's actually really common in the influencer space that the post only has to stay up for a month or 6 months or a year, and that influencers will go back and take that out of their feed later. So understanding how long you need to leave it up, understanding how the brand can use that content that you're creating for them. I just saw this in a group I was in the other day with a bunch of influencers where she was originally paid to create one Instagram post, and now they had come back and they wanted to use that image to run an ad, and they wanted to put it on the cover of some printed marketing materials. And she had come into the group to say, don't you think I should ask them to pay me more because they only paid me for a post. Now they're going to get more value out of it by using it these other ways. They're asking me for permission. Is it okay for me to negotiate back with them and say, if you want to use it in these other ways, it's going to be this additional fee? So that's something that I think most student athletes probably don't have a whole lot of experience with because they haven't been allowed to do this before now. And so really understanding that it can be super exciting to get offered $100 or $500 or $1,000 to do one Instagram post or one TikTok video, but do you really understand the agreement you have with the company in terms of how it's being used, how long it's being used, how many edits they can ask for if you're doing an Instagram post in your feed, and they make you make these tiny little edits and you're having to reshoot the photo over and over and over again. I know an influencer that this happened to. She got offered $100 for an Instagram post. She thought that was great money for her following, and it was. But there were no limit in her contract to the number of edits the brand could ask for, and she ended up reshooting the photo 11 times. And so then the $100 didn't sound so good anymore because it took way more of her time than she anticipated. So there are things like that I think that student athletes need to be more aware of so that they can work out those terms in advance. And then there's been some really interesting discussion too around state taxes, which I know doesn't sound interesting or exciting, but it's interesting in this aspect. Okay, if you live in Louisiana and you're a resident of Louisiana, but you go to school in South Carolina and you go shoot a commercial in LA, you could actually end up having to pay taxes in all 3 states on what you get paid for that promotional activity. New York City has its own, and so I was talking to actually she's local here, Katie Davis, is with a CPA with a firm here who works a lot with athletic departments, and we were talking about different examples. And she said, did you see those student athletes who were in Times Square on July 1st? And I think the Cavender twins were there, Libby Dunn was there. I can't remember who else, but you saw several student athletes who'd been taken by brands up there. They had big billboards in Times Square. They were shooting Instagram and TikTok content down in Times Square. And Katie said, did you know New York City has its own city tax if you do business there, and that they're not only going to get taxed on the value of the trip, so they're going to get taxed for that free flight they had there and the free hotel room they had and all the meals that were covered while they were there. They're going to get taxed on the value of that, even though they didn't receive cash. And not only are they going to be taxed in their home state, they're going to be taxed in New York City because they were in Times Square doing it. And did they know that? I don't know. I have no idea if they knew that or not. Maybe they did. Those are all student athletes who are at a level where they do have agents and advisors. I'm sure Brandon will talk about this more later, but there's also a lot of student athletes out there who aren't getting deals big enough to warrant having an agent. I think I've heard Brandon talk several times today about, from an agent's perspective, which student athletes you would want to work with and how difficult it can be to pull together these brand deals. And so you're gonna have a lot of student athletes who aren't gonna have that kind of advisor who's telling them, hey, just remember, if you take this free trip, you're gonna be taxed on the value of this trip. So some really interesting issues around state taxes. And then I won't belabor this point of choice of law, but when you sign a deal with a brand, if they have a written contract, and hopefully they do, there will be a choice of law provision that basically says if we disagree, this is going to be litigated in front of a court in Los Angeles. Well, if I live here in Florida and now I've got to get an attorney out there and fly out there, if we ever have a dispute, a couple of professors I've talked to have brought up some interesting issues around that choice of law provision that student athletes should be looking out for. And then you've got varying state agent requirements. Some states have a very detailed process for becoming a registered agent in the state. Some states have nothing at all. And so on a state by state basis, it really differs. And I've heard agents asking questions around, okay, if I'm an agent in Kansas, and this was actually a real example I heard a few weeks ago. If I'm an agent in Kansas, but I want to work with a student athlete who's in Louisiana, and I think they were doing a deal that was maybe in California. We had all these different states involved, and he was like, which state do I need to be registered in? And I was like, not my area of law. I don't know, ask somebody else. So there's a lot of questions coming even from brands and from agents who are getting involved in this space, trying to figure out how all the different rules apply. And then in terms of the effect we've sort of seen NIL have so far, it's been interesting in athletic departments because most people I know who work in athletics are already overworked and have too much on their plate. Both my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law have worked in college athletics the whole time I've known them. And compliance folks in these departments now got a lot dumped in their laps all at once. They thought there was going to be a national third party. They kept calling it a third party administrator. The NCAA was going to choose this third party that was going to oversee compliance, and they were going to be the ones that student athletes were going to submit their forms through, that were going to, vet all this stuff out. And then in the 11th hour, the NCAA notified all the third party administrators that they weren't going to do one after all. And so it all fell back to schools. And when you start talking about like FCS level athletic departments, Division II, Division III, a lot of those athletic departments have one person who works in compliance, who now has to handle all the other compliance issues they already had, in addition to now educating their student athletes about NIL, going through all these forms their student athletes are filling in as they do their brand deals. So I'm seeing athletic departments start to staff up a little bit. Some, especially at the Power 5 level like this, we've seen athletic departments hiring people whose job title says something about NIL. And I think that we're going to continue to see that. And then, I go ahead and go to the next slide because I'll skip some of this that is less interesting. This is a list I put together after speaking at University of Louisville because students who weren't athletes were asking me, if I'm really interested in this, how can I get involved? How can this be part of my career plan moving forward? And I think there's a ton of opportunity around this. And I've actually seen a lot of undergrad and grad students already getting involved. So there's those new jobs being created in athletic departments. Law schools and accounting programs are putting together clinics where their students are helping student athletes navigate some of this. There's obviously opportunities as agents and financial advisors and other sorts of representation. I've seen students who are becoming essentially personal assistants for a student athlete that they're friends with, who doesn't have time to go through all the stuff, all the DMs they're getting and all the stuff they're getting in their inbox relative to NIL. I've had a couple of students contact me who are acting as video editors or podcast editors for student athletes who are creating content and don't have time to do that piece of the content creation, graphic designers, website designers who are working with student athletes already, social media managers. We've seen students who are partnering with student athletes to co-found some of these platforms. So I think there's actually a lot of opportunity, even if you're not an athlete, if this is interesting to you, to get involved in it at some level, depending on what your skill level is and what your interest level is. But I think this is only going to grow, and that athletic departments are going to have whole teams of people dedicated to NIL. And so if this is something that interests you, I would encourage you to go over to the athletic department and ask them, how can you start getting involved? Because I think that every athletic department out there right now is trying to figure out how to do enough for their student athletes around this, and none of them are staffed well enough to be able to cover everything they want to do. So if this interests you, I just encourage you to look for a way to get involved, because there's definitely opportunities out there. I think I'm probably close to my end slide. I sort of talked about this stuff. We just from here, what I'm really watching is, will there be federal legislation next year? And if not, then will the NCAA come back and have more detailed rules than they originally gave us? Right now, I don't see any of that on the horizon, but we'll watch how it unfolds this school year. So sorry to fly through that. There's so much to talk about. I could do this for 3 or 4 hours, but you'll have time to ask me questions later. And if you want to email me, or you want to direct message me on Twitter or Instagram, you can find me there too. And I'm happy to answer questions later too. I'm always game to talk NIL. So thank you guys.
I'm sure there's lots of questions that are stirring. We'll keep those to your breakout sessions with her personally. We're going to take just a 5-10 minute break. You need to get water or step out for a second. You may do that, and Randall will be up to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you don't know if you're repeating yourself or not. Yeah. No, you're fine. I have so few pictures of me speaking that I was like, do all the pictures.
I had you before the day because
Pictures are never good, but I've had stuff like a diverse company show like shoot before. I don't know. I make the worst faces when I'm
it's hard to get like.
So welcome back, everybody, to round 2 of the symposium. At this point, we're going to transition into the sports agency realm. It's great to hear from Kristi Dosh with respect to name, image, likeness, but at this point, we're going to be learning from Brandon Curran. He's all the way from Los Angeles, California today. So Brandon has double majored in business administration and communications and media from the University of California, Berkeley. He has completed multiple internships with companies such as Creative Arts Agency, CBS Interactive, IMG, and the Wasserman Group. Brandon is currently the Vice President of NBA Player Marketing and Business Development at Catalyst Sport and Media, and is the founder of Social Chair. So welcome, Brandon.
Thank you. Perfect. Appreciate you all having me. So I'll kind of just start with my journey, where I'm at, what it's like to work at a sports agency, and then I can kind of dive backwards into how I got where I am. So I'll try to keep this as real world as possible. So my job is, I work at an NBA sports agency. It's in the space, it's what you'd be called a boutique, and a boutique means you focus on one sport. So we focus on NBA basketball. There's a reason I really like the NBA basketball space compared to the NFL and MLB. Those are what you call like the 4 major sports in the US market are hockey, MLB, NFL, NBA. In terms of popularity, obviously the NFL is most popular, but actually from a player standpoint, which I'll kind of dive into more, the NBA to me is the best one to be in the agency space for. And the reason why is each sport has a different players association. So you've probably heard of the NBPA, the MLBPA, and the NFLPA. The NBPA and the MLPA are very, very good at what they do. And when I mean that, I mean in terms of negotiating their collective bargaining agreement. And there's historical precedent to that, like goes way back before like free agency was not allowed in sports before, like there was like a 1970s case, which you probably know a lot more about, but that's kind of where it started. And where the NBA has really gotten is you kind of take a look at the leagues. The NFL's got like 1,800 players. The MLB's got whatever 25 times 30 is. And then the NBA has only 450. So from opportunity perspective, I could be the best offensive lineman in the NFL and I can walk down the street and people won't know my name. But if you're a top player in basketball or even a good role player, like think of like a Danny Green or like a PJ Tucker, like these aren't stars in the NBA, but they're very well known just because of the platform they're given. And there's only 15 guys on an NBA team. Also, additionally, how the leagues really approach branding and player marketing is really unique. So I would say I'm personally not a big fan of the NFL for kind of a number of reasons, but one being that they really don't allow their players to have multiple identities. And it's kind of tough for the NFL because the nature of those careers are like two to 3 years. So if I only have 2 to 3 years to work with a guy and brand him, I really can't get into, oh, what his likes, his dislikes, his personality. Like you don't really have time for that. And the NFL, they're known for promoting what they call as the shield. So the teams, the league as a whole, they don't really go, they have those tentpole players like your Patrick Mahomes and stuff. But outside of that, they really don't get too in the weeds on that. The NBA, what's really nice is the average career is like 4 years, but can go on way longer. I would say probably around like 10 years. And that really gives a guy an opportunity to get known in the marketplace. So from that, you're really able to build out a brand for a guy. And what's nice is the NBA players, if any of you guys are, obviously everyone here is on social media, if you ever take a look at guys who are not only in the league, but coming up, it's pretty insane to see like the top NFL guy would be like the 15th or 20th person in terms of the NBA. Like there's NBA players coming up, like LaMelo Ball, kind of a unique situation. I think he has like 5 or 6 million followers on Instagram. That's probably more than 99.9% of the NFL. There's guys coming up like a Mikey Williams, who was blown up on social media since from a young age because he was playing with Bronny James. He has, I think, over 2 or 3 million followers on Instagram. And like when you have that amount of reach at such a young age, you're really able to build a brand. And that's what's really exciting about NIL for players in those situations is because you have this captive audience, you can go out to a brand and work. But kind of back to what I said about how the agency space works. So not to get super technical, but if you're an MLB agent, you take 5% of someone's playing contract, which sounds great because it's, oh, Bryce Harper signs, $300 million deal, 5% of that. Again, I'm not here for math, but I think it's a good amount of money. But regardless, what's really hard about baseball, and it's kind of, you have to learn these things about each sport, is baseball, I sign a client at 18. I'm paying for him to be in the minor leagues. You're not taking any percentage off them in the minor leagues just because they're making so little money. And then for baseball, once they do get called up, they're on a set salary. And then the only time that they actually get paid will be when they're arbitration eligible. So that usually happens like 3 to 4 years into their career. Arbitration is where you basically, the agent goes to the team and then they're like, okay, the team's like, okay, we think you're worth X. And then the agent's like, oh, we think you're worth this. It never goes to trial. They always kind of figure it out ahead of time. But that's the first time you get paid. And that can occur 7 or 8 years after you sign somebody. So that's what a lot of people don't know about the sports agency world is you see these players getting drafted. Oh, they're going to make money off that. No, so that's how baseball works. Football has really gotten pretty bad, to be honest. So it used to be 3% and now it's up to 3%. So which is like it sounds like a small difference, but it's actually a huge difference. So let's say I'm signing you to be my NFL client. It used to be, standard rate is 3%. Now I have to upsell you to 3%. And a lot of agents are going under that. Oh, he's 3%. Oh, they'll charge me 2% or 1%. And now everyone's kind of undercutting themselves. And then take away that the contracts aren't guaranteed in football. And then out on top of that, the football players get injured and their average career is 2 to 3 years. Football is a very, very hard sport to make. I'm sure you saw that article recently where the NFL agent who's had some big guys, he just came out, he's like, this isn't a sustainable career. Like you're just losing so much money and there's like so much risk involved. And then from the basketball perspective, this is why I'm a fan of basketball. Now basketball is the hardest. Like the MLB draft is, I don't know how many rounds, it's so many rounds. And then the NFL draft is I think like 6 or I don't know, it's more. The NBA draft is 2 rounds and they take 60 guys. If you get drafted in the first round, you're going to get a guaranteed contract, which is great. And then NFL agents take 4%. Now, again, even with the NBA, NBA agents take 4%. Now, even with the NBA, this 4% rate that you're going to take, that's not on the first deal. So I sign you, let's say I sign him, 18 years old, I got to pay for his pre-draft training. That's usually around 100 grand. So 100 grand in the hole. And then, I'm not saying this happens, but if he has somebody on his team who wants to steer me to a certain agent, people do have to pay that. So now, you're in the hole for that money too. It's usually structured as like a marketing advance. So let's say I think you'll bring in $2 million in marketing. I'll give you an upfront amount, and then as you make that, you pay me back. But even from there, let's say we keep going. Now, if you're a top guy, you'll get a good shoe deal with like a Nike or someone big like that. That's when I can actually recoup money. But if you're not a top guy and there's not as many top shoe deals out there anymore, because it's kind of oversaturated at the point, and most guys are going to wear Nike anyways, you don't need to be signing them. So let's say you play like 3 years, great, then you're eligible for your second contract. But on the first one, you'll get, wherever you get drafted, it's a slotted agreement. So let's say if you guys want to Google just like 2021 NBA first round pick contracts, they'll give you a number there. And that's the 100% number. Only thing an agent can do is negotiate 80% of that number, which obviously you're not going to do that, or 120% of that number. When you do the 120%, you're only entitled to get 4% of the difference between the original amount and what you negotiated. So you're really not going to make much. So for the first 4 years of an NBA client, outside of the marketing, don't expect to make any money. So your job in those 4 years, and a lot of agents don't even try to commission their guys those years because they're just trying to keep them around for the second contract. And that's when the NBA agent world is actually like probably the best. If you can hold a guy for those 4 years, which can be challenging, then you could sign that big deal. And now what you're seeing with guys nowadays, just because the max salary is going up, you'll see guys that are they're signing like 5 years, $200 million deal. That's $40 million a year. You do 4% of that. Again, the math eludes me, but I think that's like $1.6 million a year in commission. That's actually something that you can live off. And so that's why I'm personally biased towards the NBA agency realm. But again, there's not that many guys that are getting drafted each year. So it's a very small quantity. And it's only 450 guys in the league. There's guys constantly coming in. There's guys constantly coming out. My role, so that's the player agent world. Very hyper competitive. You have to be able to sleep knowing somebody's trying to steal your client all times of the day. Anyone can be reached now pretty easily. Either that's through like, oh, I know your teammate, can you introduce me to that player? I'll be his agent. Or, oh, I'll just DM you. Or I'll find other ways to get in contact with you. Like there was a case that came out. There was a case that came out a few months ago where a player actually met somebody at a teammate's birthday party, and his agent was there celebrating his birthday. And then you're going to overcross like that. So it really is the kind of job where you kind of always have to just honestly be trusting in your relationship and feel like you have that deep connection with the guy. My job is the player marketing standpoint. So if you don't have relationships with players, and I grew up in Los Angeles playing basketball, but I didn't make any relationships with players. So I didn't really have these connections into an agency. So the next best thing I could do, which unless anyone here knows any like soon to be professional basketball players or athletes, if you do, congratulations. That'll help your life a little bit. But if you don't, and you're like me, the best route that you can go is you're just going to have to network and do internship after internship after internship. So I'll kind of go into my journey a little bit there. So as I said, grew up in LA. I went to UC Berkeley I double majored in their business school and in media studies. They're not known for their sports programs or having any sports programs like this. So I would say you guys are very lucky in this sense. So I just started working for the Cal Athletics Department. They literally sent an email, hey, do you want to buy student tickets? And on the side, it had to add, do you want to be a sports marketing intern? I was like, oh, that sounds like something I should be doing. So I applied to that. I would work game days. That led to something with the Golden State Warriors. And this is kind of the thing where you always want to be talking and networking and seeing what opportunities are out there. So during the nights during the week, I would go down to Oracle Arena, which was in Oakland at the time, and I would work game operations for the Golden State Warriors. This was by far not a glamorous job, but honestly, to me at that point, if I got a polo and a credential, it was all I needed as a job, which is still cool these days. But then going from there, I was paid $40 a game, but I had to pay $5 for the bar. And then I would have to eat dinner at the game, which was a hot dog. So I'm netting $30 after this game. Honestly, that's great to even be paid for some of these internships. I think the world has changed a little bit where you can't be doing these unpaid internships anymore unless you're getting academic credit. So things might be a little easier for you, but started working for them. And then I got my first agency break when I applied for an internship at CAA in their sports group. I don't know how many of you are familiar with CAA. They're the largest talent and sports agency out there. So they represent like Steven Spielberg, Leonardo DiCaprio, Oprah, all those big names. And then in 2006, they did what's called an agency roll-up, where they basically launched their sports group and they acquired a bunch of other agencies. The history of that's actually really interesting. Is basically there was this one original agency, IMG, which had everybody, and they were starting like the 60s to be like Arnold Palmer's agent. And then they fired one of the agents. It was like Casey Close, Tom Condon, who's like the big NFL quarterback agent. And then someone else, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was interesting because they fired one of these people, but they had a key man clause in their contract. The key man clause says, if I fire you, then I could take these people with me after I left. So basically, IMG decided at that point, like, hey, we're going to get out of the player representation space. Like, we're going to focus more so on the events and the sponsorships and media rights. That led to the creation of CAA Sports, which became the largest agency now, probably has over like 500 or 600 clients across baseball, basketball, football, hockey, tennis, golf. There is what you call like a mega agency. So someone that has a representation across multiple sports. The other mega agencies are Wasserman, Excel. I used to work on one called Relativity Sports, which was big. So it's kind of varies in that sense. But this was my first agency experience. I was 19, and to be honest, I was not a good intern in retrospect. Like I remember I fell asleep in some meetings. I was 19. I was not sleeping enough, and but I learned, and like some of the key takeaways from that was like it was very interesting. Right, it was like the highest thing they stressed to us was write handwritten thank you notes, which I've never even thought about up until then. But when you think about now, and especially where we are now in like the digital age, I encourage everyone here to write a handwritten thank you note. Not only because it's a nice gesture, but if you just think about like the process of it, oh, I write it, I mail it, I receive it, it's on my desk, I have it there. Oh, I'm constantly just seeing something. There's everybody who's interacting with me on LinkedIn and on the screens and stuff. And then there's the one person who wrote a handwritten, tangible thank you note. So that's kind of a really good takeaway I had from there. Then I started doing, and at this point, I was just like, oh, I'm just going to keep doing sports agency internships, which in retrospect was not the best idea, but I can get to that later. But essentially from there, I worked for IMG College, so kind of doing sponsorship stuff. So essentially schools like Florida, they have sponsors, like, as you know, team sponsors and stuff. And then they have someone who does these activations. So that's actually, you know, me and you might negotiate it, but someone has to actually make sure it happens. And you have to like do a recap of it and share it with the sponsor. So I was working in that space. And then before my senior year, I did an internship at CBS Interactive, which was actually really cool. It was in San Francisco and it was not in sports. And this is where I would say my biggest regret in my professional life was, is I did too many agency specific internships within the sports realm. And that was in my mind, oh, I want to work at agency. Let me do 3. Well, 4 is better than 3, 5 is better than 4. But then in retrospect, when I'm trying to get hired by an agency, it's not really a value to be like, hey, I used to work for your competitor. Do you want an introduction to them? No, I already know that. They try to steal my clients. Why would I ever want to talk to them? So that's something I've always wanted to. I wish I diversified into working at a brand that gets involved in sports, working at a players union, working at a league, just working at somewhere where I can bring some value to the agency was really helpful. And then kind of fast forward, I did an internship at Wasserman too. And that was a good experience. And then kind of cool, I applied to be the assistant to the CEO at the company that was called Relativity Media, which was like a mini major movie studio. They produce movies like Limitless, Masterminds, other movies like that. And I didn't get it. And then they told me in the HR, they were like, oh yeah, this was great, but we'll keep your resume on file. I'm sure everyone here has heard that and knows that means we're never going to talk to you again. This actually wasn't true. They actually did keep my resume on file. This woman in HR I really connected with. And again, I made sure to maintain a relationship with her. So, hey, if I started a new job or if I did something or if I had a side project go live or if I wrote a blog, just chime in, hey, hope you're doing well. here's what I've been working on, because you just want to stay top of mind with people. And a lot of things in life is just being top of mind when an opportunity presents itself. Like, let's say I'm a brand and, oh, wow, I now have a budget to do something. My whole goal with these companies is to have our players be top of mind for that. So they called me back in July that year. So it was like 5 months. And then they're like, oh, we actually have a job to be the second assistant to Happy Walters. And I was like, oh, this is great. I already know who Happy Walters is. I've never been an assistant before. All I know about being an assistant is what I've seen on Entourage with Lloyd, which is very accurate to what my job was. And that was honestly, it was a really good teaching moment, because when you're an assistant, you realize like your first client is your boss. I have one client, that's my boss. And what you kind of learn being an assistant is like, you can't just assume everything's going to happen A to B. You have to make sure A to B happens, but C, D, E, and F don't as well. So you can't just do something and hope it works out for the best. You need to make sure every other thing. And this is from everything from like just getting a reservation at lunch, getting dinner reservations, scheduling meetings, just answering the phone correctly, making sure the right people are being connected through. There were times when people called me like, oh, I know Happy. And my boss's name was Happy Walters, which is interesting. He actually was good friends with Adam Sandler growing up. So that's where the Happy Gilmore comes from, Happy Walters. So kind of interesting connection there. But you'd have to actually take care of these things, and you learn on the job, but there's a lot of times when you would screw up. And I tell this to my intern today, it's like, no one's going to be mad at you for screwing up, but just learn from your mistakes, because it's fine if you screw up, everyone screws up, but don't keep repeating the same mistake, because then you're not really engaged, you're not really paying attention and learning. So this time as assistant was, I would say, like very interesting. I mean, I had to get his coffee every day. I still have his Starbucks order memorized in my head, a venti skinny vanilla latte with an extra shot. Like these are the kind of things that you just have to be wired to. But what I realized is it really made me a better employee, because you take care of everything. And when eventually I would work with players, I would take this same mentality. Instead of having one client who's my boss, I have like 10 NBA guys who I now work with. So within this experience, I had an epiphany early on, and I kind of suggest this to everyone here, is develop hard quantitative skills. When I say that, I mean, learn how to build PowerPoints, learn Canva, learn Excel, learn Photoshop. That's when you were talking about all those skills. These are things that I've actively looked for our players. I can't do video editing. I'm not going to learn how to do video editing. All this stuff, these are very valuable that will get you in and get you to kind of build out your body of work. So what you really want to do is kind of create a moat around yourself in the terms of like, because like one day you'll be an assistant, you'll be 22, 23, everything will be great, but then the next day you'll be 25 and you're like, I don't want to be an assistant anymore. How are you going to protect against another 22-year-old who will get paid for nothing, is super excited to just be answering the phone? So you really need to build out this skill set to kind of protect yourself. So I had that epiphany. I was like, damn, if I got fired today, I would have to restart somewhere as someone else's assistant. And I really don't want to do that. So I basically started teaching myself PowerPoint, started teaching myself Excel. PowerPoint was really cool because previously we were using a design agency to do all of our recruiting presentations. Design agencies are not good for a variety of reasons. One, I'll be like, hey, can you sub out this photo? And they'll be like, yeah, that's $500 and you'll get it in 1 to 2 weeks. And it's like, we have a recruiting meeting like the next day. So I learned to just kind of do the PowerPoints on my own. And what was cool about this is, yes, I was doing my job as an assistant, but I also started to know, oh, who were we recruiting? And I started to also work with our players directly. And then you kind of in the flow of information, and then you're making yourself like an essential employee where it's like, oh, wow, yeah, we need to recruit. Oh, so then we need someone to build those presentations. And that's going to be Brandon because he's doing it way faster than those design agency people. And then another thing I did, which I really suggest is just in general for any career, but specifically sports, is be very well read about the space. There's a lot of great resources. All of you are in college, so SportsBusiness Journal is available to you at like, I think like $50 for the semester, which is great because it's not for us. It's like extremely expensive. I think it's like $3,000 or something, but it is actually super expensive. But when you kind of read the trades of, and this is for whatever industry you want to work in, when you read the trades, you may not understand like what you're reading, like an RSN, like media rights deal or like whatever this means, but you're going to learn the terms and you're going to Google it. And you're not only going to be able to understand it, but then when you're in interviews, you're going to be able to talk and be able to hold your own in a conversation where it's a point where it's like, oh, okay, this person actually does know what's going on in sports. They're not just here because they have been playing sports since they were 6 years old. Side note, if someone asks you why you want to work in sports, don't say because you've been playing your whole life or you love sports. Everyone loves sports. We hear this all the time. It's really, you're blowing a really good opportunity to separate yourself, because knowing everyone does say that, you can say something that's completely different. And that's kind of your why and why you want to work in it. But from there, you kind of just need, I just kept building it. And then I started writing these articles. So I would read all these articles and then I would start sending them to my boss. And he originally was like, just send me interesting articles. But I started to analyze them because I wanted to show that, hey, I'm not just a guy who answers the phone and gets Starbucks. I can actually like think about things and get Starbucks, not screw up the order. But from there, I kept kind of building it, and he would slowly add people. And then at one point he emailed the whole sports group, which at the time was like 100 people. And he's like, hey, going forward, Brandon's going to be sending you these articles. So every Monday I would stay at the office till like 12 at night and just like collect all the articles and then analyze them. And then I would send it out. And what was really cool about it is like, here I am like 22, 23 years old, and I'm telling like 100 people who are all older than me and more experienced, here's what the major news is, here's why it matters. And it really helped get me a lot of exposure within the company and build a lot of good, unique relationships. From there, it got really interesting. So how deep should I go in this? Should I just...
Keep going, you're doing great.
Okay, all right. So from there, and this was May 2015, we had one of the best NFL football classes. So there was this agent at CAA who left named Ben Dogra. He came over to join. He represented like Richard Sherman, Adrian Peterson, AJ Green. So he was a really big guy. So after we got him and then we kind of combined our recruiting classes, we had 3 of the top 7 picks in the 2015 draft. And then like 6 guys go in the first round. So that was like, oh man, like here's where our model's working. We're like this large agency. But then unfortunately, the media side of our agency, so we were connected to like an independent movie studio called Relativity Media. We were Relativity Sports. That studio came up, they took on a lot of debt and then they stopped producing quality movies that weren't doing well at the box office. So then they had to go into Chapter 11. So we went from May, we were like the top, like on the heels of CAA as the top agency, to July having to explain to our clients like, hey, here's what a Chapter 11 means. And if any agent has the opportunity to reach out, like there's any sign of like blood in the water or anything, they're going to hit up all your clients and be like, oh yeah, they're not going to be able to pay you. Like your agency's going under, like we need to find a new agent. And how the money flows in an agency, like we don't pay players, like they get paid and then they pay us. So it didn't even make sense, but it was interesting in the sense of like, hey, that's what people are going to do and say what they have to say. So then it went to the point where I was like, all right, well, now this company is not doing well. We're starting to lose clients because obviously it's bad for your image and stuff. So people are starting other agencies. So then me and my boss, it was interesting. He would start emailing me on my private email more. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I started to put it together, like what was going on. He was telling me to buy domain names. I was like, oh, okay, like we're obviously going to be starting a new agency. So that was a really good experience in the sense of like, he had the opportunity to kind of choose me. And there's actually a pretty cool story where I found this out later from my friend who worked in HR, but I hope no one here has to go through a Chapter 11, but what happened in a Chapter 11 is they hire an outside consulting firm to essentially say like, all right, because you're going to submit a plan to a court and you need to be like, yo, we're going to fire 40% of people or whatever. So the outside agency came in and said, oh, we need to cut everyone who has more than one assistant. So a lot of the top people at the company would have like 2 or 3 assistants. My boss had 2. So it was July 31st. I actually remember 2015. And it's weird how these dates stick in your head, but I guess it's traumatic. But I get to the office that day. I'm just minding my business. And then they called in 75 people from our company. It's like a 300-person company. They call in 75 people and they like in a room like this, and the bankruptcy consultants get up there and they just lay everybody off. And they don't provide severance, which is like very like screwed up to do. I was gonna cuss it. And then I was like, damn, all my friends just got fired. This is like very sad and stuff. And then my boss, who's super casual, he's seen a lot of things. He just calls me that night. He's like, oh yeah, like by the way, like you were supposed to get fired today, but like I just transferred you over to sports. So like you need to deal with that with HR tomorrow. I was like, oh, okay, sick, thanks. And then what I realized, like he could have very much let me go because he had his one assistant, it would have been out of his hands. And I would have been like, I understand, it's just like larger circumstances. But because he saw me doing the PowerPoints, like learning Excel, doing these newsletters every week, he was like, okay, this kid actually like gives a shit and actually wants to be here. So I'm going to kind of spare him. And then what I learned from my friend actually is he went in the meeting before they laid everyone off and saw my name on the list. So I was like this close to getting fired, like, which is actually, like, if he was late that day, I would have been fired, I guess. But regardless, he saw my name. He was like, no, Brandon's not getting fired. And they're like, no, we have to do this. He's like, no, it's not happening. And he just crossed my name off. And then like, that was the end of that. So that's a really good way to kind of view like your relationships are key in every industry you do, but especially ones like agencies, where agencies are really at the end of the day, a network of relationships. There's the brand of the agency, there's the infrastructure of the company. That's all nice. But at the end of the day, when you really kind of break it down, you're an athlete, I'm your agent, we have a relationship. I go out and try to bring you revenue, you pay me for doing that job. At the end of the day, like when you try to boil it down, that's what it really comes down to. So you need to really evaluate if you want to work in the agency space, like your relationships are 100% key. So then in the middle of the night, we start to move all our stuff to this new office, started a whole new company called Catalyst. And then I was tasked with, oh, I'm no longer an assistant. Great job, Brandon. But now I have to do everything that no one would ever want to do. I had to buy furniture, which I have no taste in furniture. I didn't know what I would be buying. I had to build the company website, hadn't done that. And that's an interesting transition where you kind of go from being an assistant where my net worth is tied to my boss. So you kind of have coverage in the sense of like, as long as your boss is there, you'll always have a job. So there is a safety net with that. And a lot of assistants do go through that, where it's really hard to get from under your boss's shadow, but it's also a very safe place to be. Then when you kind of go out on your own, I went to my boss and I created a PowerPoint, obviously. And I basically said, like, here's what I want my new role to be. Here's all the stuff I currently do, AKA stuff I never want to do again, i.e. Starbucks. And here's all the stuff I do on the side. And here's all the stuff I could do in my new role. And this is not how you negotiate any job or salary, but I started doing this job before getting a pay raise, which was not smart. Like, that's not how you want to negotiate anything. You want to get your salary before you start doing the job. But I was just, trying to get out of being an assistant. So I started doing this role. I did it for a year. I was able to finally get like a pay raise from there. And then I started doing the NBA player marketing. And what was kind of interesting is our head of NBA player marketing just left. So NBA player marketing, just to give you an overview, is just player marketing. So anything a player does off the court is in my purview. That's everything from your traditional sponsorships I've worked with companies like Robinhood, CashApp, Coinbase, Chipotle, State Farm, Levi's, Burberry, Born and Raised is actually one of the companies I've worked with. That's kind of what you do. And then you also like build media properties. So one of our guys, I used to work with De'Aaron Fox. He's super into gaming. I created and launched his YouTube channel. That got to like 255,000 subscribers. That was a really good experience. Again, no one ever said, Brandon, your job is to build a YouTube channel. But that's kind of what you do when you're doing everything off the court. So our head of that just left. And at that point, I was just doing like car dealership deals, which I've said throughout this trip, they're the worst deals to do because they don't get paid. You're just exchanging tickets. The players can sometimes be nice to the car, other times maybe not be nice to the car. And then you got to explain to a dealership why they weren't nice to your car. And it's just not good, but it's good to get your feet wet and kind of that. And then once he left, then I started doing paid deals for our guys. And then that just kind of grew. So that started in 2017. 2016, 2017 is when I started doing that. So I've been doing this for about 5 years now. And the guys I work with right now are guys like John Wall, Marcus Smart, Iman Shumpert, RJ Hampton, Romeo Langford, and Spencer Dinwiddie. And then my relationship with NIL has actually been very interesting. So when we do recruiting, it used to be like, oh, if you're a top player, sorry to keep using an example, but you're a top player. If you're a top player, oh, I'll be able to get you a deal with Chipotle, Coinbase, all these things. And what was unfortunate is a lot of agents would come in and kind of say that and not really be super, like, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they can kind of oversell you there. But what's actually really nice now is players can sign for NIL representation. So what that means is like, I'm not signing with you as an agent because I would lose my eligibility, but I'm signing with you to handle my marketing for this year. So basically players get a trial run, which I think is good because it kind of can separate the people who are full of it and the people who actually do deals and stuff. I would say from my perspective, just in terms of how an agency works. So I mentioned how we make money off the contracts, 4%. Essentially what you get for the marketing is it's usually like 15 to 20%. So if you do a deal for 100 grand, whatever, you're going to take home, the agency will get 15 to 20% of that. So you're obviously want to do a lot of these and it can be a substantial amount of of revenue for your company. But honestly, from that, when I'm looking at NIL, how many current college athletes have like the name notoriety to kind of do these large enough deals that it makes sense to spend my time on it? There's a handful. But what a lot of agencies are doing is, and it's actually really funny because a lot of agents are hitting me up now and being like, hey, can you do deals for this guy I'm recruiting? And then if he signs with me, I'll let you continue to do deals with him. And that's one of the worst offers I've ever heard, because it's like, so I have to do the deal, get the deal, give them to you, and then you get all the high reward. I was like, that's not really fair. But it's interesting because these agents now want to, the paradigm flipped. So they now want to, oh, I need to bring deals to a guy to actually sign them, which I think is good because it actually shows who can actually do things. But it's very interesting because there's going to be a lot of people who are reading these headlines and a lot of players saying, oh, I'm this next guy, I should be getting these deals. Like the quarterback at Alabama, when it was like, oh, Nick Saban was like, oh, he's nearing 7 figures. So I've talked to one of the companies that he worked with, and I know how much his deal was with them, and it was not near 7 figures. It was a very good deal. It was over 6 figures, but it wasn't near 7 figures. So I think Nick Saban there is doing a little like, kind of like pumping up the Alabama brand. Oh, go to Alabama, you'll be able to make $1 million in deals. Majority of guys aren't going to be able to get that just because there's an oversaturation. And if you think who has these large followings, it's very kind of few and far between. So from the agency perspective, I would say agencies are very particular about who they work with. So they're not going to sign everyone under the sun. I've had a lot of players approach me about it. And I operate in the sense of like, I think why I'm good at my job is I genuinely believe in our clients. Like Romeo Langford, someone I work with, one of the greatest guys. He loves Chipotle. I will go back to Chipotle with him every day of the week because this guy genuinely loves it. And he tells me these unique stories about it. If a guy doesn't really have that unique passion or something, or maybe he's not like, doesn't have like that marketability, I'm not going to feel like I could do the best job by them. And yeah, it may look cool for me to sign this player. Oh, Brandon signed 5 athletes, college athletes for NIL. That's great. But in 2 months when I haven't gotten them a deal, do you think they're going to keep me around? 50-50. And then my reputation gets kind of dragged through the mud. Oh yeah, Brandon didn't do anything for me. Oh, like he just wanted to sign me, but then he's not going to actually like do any deals for me. So that's kind of how NIL is incorporating into my job. I think it's really good. I think the players should still be paid. I think it's kind of a substitute for that right now. I think majority of guys are going to do like these group deals, which I'm personally not a fan of. And the deal with like the Gene Company, for example, we call that like the CPA deal. It's like cost per acquisition or whatever. And what the issue with that is I'm posting on my social media about it. And if no one buys it, then I'm giving you free exposure and free brand awareness. And there's no guaranteed compensation for me. So I can tell you, I do not do deals that do not have guaranteed compensation for the guy, unless he's a big fan and you get him product, but you're never exchanging something for just product. Just because if you're in the NBA, you probably have minimum 100,000 followers on Instagram. So the value you're getting is not equivalent to what you get from like free clothes or free shirts or something. Yeah, but kind of in the whole, what I kind of want to emphasize there is like the key takeaways I would say is like for the agency world, just be very pragmatic. I think people have a big misconception about it just because of what's out there in the media. You have Jerry Maguire, which is kind of dated now. And then you have Ballers, which Ballers, like their financial advisors, they literally tell you your budget. They're not buying football teams and like going around like the city of Miami, like driving fast cars. That's not what a financial advisor does. If your financial advisor is doing that, I would get another financial advisor. And there's a lot of misconceptions like, oh, I see like an NBA agent sitting at the table with the top NBA pick. Oh, that must be a great job. He just gets to sit there. So many things are going on in that moment. He could be getting his client stolen. That has happened during drafts when your client switches agents because you're dropping in the draft and they switch to someone in that draft. The family could be upset about something. The player could be like, yo, you promised me top 15. Now I'm top 30. Now you have to explain that and stuff. So there's a lot of misconceptions about it. But I will say what is really rewarding about the space is number one, there's a very high upside in terms of there's no limit to what you can do because you're aligned with the players. So if you want to launch a podcast, if you want to launch a cryptocurrency, if you want to do a deal with Chipotle, if you want to have a YouTube, you literally can do whatever you want. You're not hamstrung by, oh, this is an NBA thing, this is a NBA team thing. But also kind of understand like where there's high risk, where there's high reward, there's high risk. And at any given time, someone could just leave you. And it can be really unfortunate because there's players who I've talked to several times a week, almost every day. And then one day you hear he left the agency, he didn't text you, he didn't say goodbye or anything. It's literally like a breakup. And it's like, damn, it's sad. And then it's like you come across something on like social media, you're like, oh, I'm gonna send this to him. Oh, damn, we broke up. It's not that bad, but it's literally like a very it's personal relationship. So if you like working with people, it's a really good job. And if you really care and invested, and you're not driven by like the glamour or fame, because like I will say there are nice perks to the job. Like if we had a guy who was on the LA Clippers, I live in LA, he would leave tickets for me every game. So I would go to like probably 25 to 30 NBA games a year. That is cool. I'm not going to downplay that it's cool, but for how much I'm not going to cuss against stuff that you have to go through, it's not going to pay off long term. Like you're not going to be thinking about, oh, that free game I went to at Staples Center was so sick that I now have to go get the coffee. Or one of our players rented a car and just said, hey, I'm leaving it at the airport. You figure it out. That happened before. So a lot that will get you burned out very quickly. But if you have an intrinsic motivation, like, yo, I really want to help these guys. My why is I love seeing a guy go from like a 19-year-old kid we recruit with their parents to starting a family and having kids and like seeing them grow and getting them the best opportunity to not only succeed during their career, but afterwards. That's what really excites me. And then also putting 2 and 2 together in terms of partnerships. So I work with Spencer Dinwiddie. He's super big into crypto. I got him a deal with Coinbase. That's what I call like a 1 + 1 = 3 partnership. That's not the kind of thing he'll post on Instagram. And everyone's like, oh, you're just a huge sellout for this. Everyone's be like, yeah, this makes sense. He loves crypto. He tried to tokenize his contract. So those would be like my main advice in the sports agency space. I think we can discuss some more in the breakout sessions, but that was kind of a not so brief background on my role and kind of how everything interacts.
Share a really quick, there's quite a few questions, so I don't think we'll get them in the Q&A. But what qualities do you think a great sport agent should have, and what you've seen in the industry?
Yeah, great qualities. You need to be hard-headed and like have perseverance. You're going to get told no a lot. I always say count your wins, not your losses. I couldn't tell you how many companies I reached out to about doing deals with our guys that I don't hear back from, or a deal doesn't work out. But again, the companies I listed are the result of me trying and persevering. Then also from that is your ability to network. That is actually something I will self-admit I'm not the best at. Just because I started out without having any connections, I was like, I'm going to do this by me. I'm going to only rely on myself. I don't want to have to ask others for favors. And that will get you to a certain point. But there's after a certain point, if you do have that network where you can be like, hey, like I would like to, like, it's random, but I play basketball with this guy who's an ESPN reporter, and he knows if you're an ESPN reporter who does like basketball news, you know all the agencies. So I was like, oh, I'm trying to talk to someone at that agency. Like, can you make that introduction? And boom, I was able to talk to that person within a week. That wouldn't have happened if I went like I'm going to email them on the website or try to go through LinkedIn or anything like that. So your ability to like persevere and then your ability to just network and maintain relationships is what I'd say the most valuable qualities.
And did you share the LinkedIn story of how you got that?
Oh, I got the job on LinkedIn.
Yeah, how you found that person, like when you were applying for an internship.
Oh, yeah. So there was a job at Wasserman, which is one of the big agencies. And I wanted to work there. And what I did my senior year in January, I typed in Wasserman on LinkedIn, very simple. And I was like, okay, I don't know anyone there. That's what you call first degree contact. But the second degree contact, I knew somebody who knew somebody. And that's all you really need. So if I can give any one piece of advice to everyone here, don't apply on company websites because that just goes into an abyss. It might feel good for you, like, oh, I spent all this time doing this cover letter. Not going to get really seen, especially in the smaller ones. I think CAA has a built-out portal where they do check that, but even so, like you want to have a direct connection. So what you want to do is basically type in the company you want to work at, and then see, okay, I know this person, and then just ask your friend for an introduction to them. If they don't give it to you, they don't know the person well, which is actually very common on LinkedIn. You're connected with people you've never met and don't know at all. What you could do after that is then just send them a message and don't be generic about it. Be really particular. Like, hey, I went, and if they went to Florida or if you have some connection like that, always play that up because people love thinking about their old college days. So anytime, seriously, like anytime you bring up college, like people are like, oh, this is like me 10 years ago. What a great kid. I'll talk to him. But from there, you really want to have like a specific ask. So I have a lot of people who reach out to me and they just say like, hey, I think your job's cool, I'd love to connect. And that's just like, I get a lot of those, and that's just not unique. Like, you should have a very specific ask and be like, hey, I saw you did this. This is really cool. I would love to talk to you like this. And say for an informational interview, don't say it's for a job. People don't like that because they don't want to be like, hey, I'm asking you for something. I mean, you may want to later on, but what you need to build is that relationship. So what I did that in January, got coffee with this guy. It's probably 20 minutes, wasn't anything major. I wrote a handwritten thank you note. And then in May, when I saw an opening for an internship, then I emailed them, hey, how have you been? I obviously checked in before that too, just to keep up the relationship. But then once I saw the opening, I was like, oh, hey, saw this cool job. I attached my resume. I think I would be great for this for XYZ reason. And then from that, he was like, oh yeah, I'll send it to the hiring manager because he knows who's hiring for it. You just skip the whole abyss of the whole website and you skip like 80% of the hard part. That's not going to get you the job. But when you have a warm referral like that, that is really going to take you so much farther than just trying to reach out and do it the harder way. So, and then I was able to interview for that and was able to get it. And it was a really good experience. And that's the LinkedIn story. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we really appreciate you, Brandon. That was great. So we're just gonna take another quick break. We're pull up some chairs. We're just gonna do a quick Q&A with them based on question from the Zoom, and then also that you guys, some of you sent them. Oh yeah, do y'all want to just then I can move my. So true. It's like, well, we've been to dinner, we've had breakfast at this point. Okay, are we good, Brian?
Good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so yes, thank you for all of you who threw in some questions, and then those of you who are on the Zoom who've done the chat box. We really appreciate it. So a couple things to get started. I'll direct the questions, and then some of them are both. So yeah, if you so the first one we'll start with is branding versus social media marketing. What's the difference for you guys in your fields, and how does that how do students get involved in both sides, or what is the kind of definition of both for you?
That's a good question. I'd say for branding is kind of like the image you put out to the world. So I would say branding kind of includes social media marketing. Let's just say social media marketing is you doing a partnership that includes social media posts. So your branding is like, let's say I'm a NBA player and I love playing video games. My branding is posting my streams on my Twitch channel or on my YouTube or on my Instagram. That's me kind of branding myself. And then when you do social media marketing, then that's when you kind of find a partnership that builds into that as well. But then there's also branding is kind of a open-ended term.
I feel like when we talk about personal branding, it's how other people perceive you, who they think you are. And I was on a panel at a women's conference one time, and this other woman who I wish I could give her credit, except that I don't remember her name all these years later, but I think she read it in a book. So she was borrowing it from somebody else, so we'll just keep passing it down. But she said that your brand right now is the third thing someone says about you. So when your professor or your supervisor at work introduces you to somebody, they're almost always going to say your name, your job title, or like in all of your cases, you know, what year you are in school or what your major is. I just did in a journalism class yesterday, and the professor had just gone around the room and been like, you know, Kelly's a sophomore and she wants to do this, and Brian's a junior and he wants to do that. And so then I had this part of my speech later, and I was like, that was your personal brand, like that thing he said about you and what you're interested in, you know, that's what your brand is right now. And I started listening to what people were saying about me when they would introduce me in social settings. And that was back when I was an attorney, and they would say, you know, this is Kristi. She's, you know, a second year at our law firm, and she writes a lot about sports. And that was my brand in my firm, was that everyone knew, even though that wasn't my practice area, that that was something I was passionate about and that I was doing on the side. And it was interesting because the last conference I went to as a lawyer was a sports law conference, and I was sitting next to a guy at lunch, or I had been sitting next to him all day. So we've been talking about all kinds of stuff. So by that point, he knew that I was writing for Forbes, and that, you know, by that point I had a book deal, and I was doing all this stuff around writing about sports business. At the end of the conference, he said, if I see you here next year and you're still practicing law, I'm gonna be really disappointed in you. I was like, what are you talking about? And he was like, you really should be in media full time. Like you shouldn't be practicing law anymore. And I thought he was totally cuckoo, but he was right. And actually by the next year I was working at ESPN as their sports business reporter. So I think that's an interesting thing, is to start listening to how people introduce you like that. And that is your brand. And then your brand can be part of your social media. Like on social media, I don't use Kristi Dosh as my username. And I'm not encouraging you to come up with things, but way back in the day when I created my Twitter 11 years ago, 12 years ago, I did Sports Biz Miss because I wanted to emphasize the fact that I was a woman talking about the business of sports, because there really weren't any at that time. And that became my brand and has stuck with me all these years. And now I go to conferences and events and I can be talking to somebody for 10 minutes with my name tag on that says Kristi Dosh. And 10 minutes into the conversation, they'll go, wait a second, are you Sports Biz Miss? I'm like, no one knows my real name.